Okay, guys. So this is some information and some writing instruction that you can use if you find yourself actually stuck for different ways to probe quotations in language. So this is an example of different ways that you can tackle analytical writing really after you've included or incorporated quotations into your paragraph. So this is really when we're talking about how to analyze in depth and detail. These are a range of different sentence structures and habits of thinking as well that you can use to make sure you're doing it with some depth. So the first category here are sentence structures that are useful for dealing with ambiguity, double meanings, or uncertainties, layers or nuances of meaning. The first one is the reader positioning, and this could be, if you were talking about drama, audience positioning, being caught between something. So the sedem would be the reader is caught between something and something. And here's an example. The reader is caught between a sense of disgust at the pederastic desires of the protagonist, we're talking about Death in Venice here, and a sense of empathy for his somewhat tragic demise. So when you have mixed feelings about a character or a moment in the text, the reader being caught between two things is something that you can think about and use to demonstrate your understanding of ambiguity and nuance. If you're then talking about multiple character motivations, you could say, so-and-so is motivated not only by, but also by. And here's an example with the maniac. The maniac is motivated not only by his desire to expose corruption, but also by his sense of exuberance and performative dynamism, which drives him into multiple shifting permutations. So he's not just about the exposure of corruption, he's driven by his performance and his energetic exuberance. So again, if you've got a character that's got multiple components or multiple motivations, you think here of Aschenbach, Aschenbach being motivated not only by his ostensible desire for Apollonian beauty, but also by the Dionysian drive to seek out libidinous sexual desire and his own destruction. You've got there a really complex articulation of the multifaceted nature of his character. Then you have character transformation. You could talk about a particular individual and how they transform across the text. So by the close of the play, the poem, the story, the previously something individual has developed into a. And so here's an example dealing with Fight Club. By the end of the story, the previously anodyne, kind of bland and boring, an alienated protagonist has developed into an individual possessing some aspects of a coherent, integrated self. So that's a sentence structure there for allowing you to tell the story of a character's transformation. Pulling out both sides of a particular idea or issue is useful if you use a subordinate in conjunction sentence, which we've looked at a lot in class. You might start with even though, or although, or while, or meanwhile. While, not meanwhile. Each of those are subordinate in conjunctions. So you have even though something, we also realize something. So you might say, if you were talking about the imagery in Death in Venice, even though the ekphrastic imagery constructs an idealized vision of the child, his central purpose is to expose the unreliable nature of the protagonist's vision. So yes, even though the imagery gives us a beautiful vision of Tadzio, its main purpose is to show us basically how mental Aschenbach is. If you're evaluating, again, that sentence structure can be a useful one to adopt in order to weigh up the importance of different ideas, dualities, or contrasting opinions. So here, even though the narrative perspective seems to voice the hostilities evident in the community, it also affirms the voice of the character, granting her a sense of agency and empowerment. So we're talking there about the narrative voice in Crossing the Mangrove. So we've got there double-sided nature of authorial intent with a particular stylistic feature. And this is a really crucial one. Proposing a tentative idea or proposing an idea tentatively, being suggestive rather than explicit and definite. Perhaps someone is suggesting. Perhaps man is warning us about, that should be is, not was, don't use the past tense. Perhaps man is suggesting or is warning us about the dangers of restraining the impulsive components of our being for too long in excess by providing us with the view of its dramatic repercussions. So that tentative language, perhaps it may be, it could be that, it might be, is really useful for thinking about overall authorial intention and evaluating what a writer is attempting to do. Now, much more useful to you are these sentence structures, which are about adding detail and depth to analysis. So, again, you can't use these every single paragraph in a sort of consistent cycle because you'll end up with something very formulaic. So you have to judge each example that you're trying to probe for suitability. The first one is initial impression, closer inspection. And this is useful for if you're trying to articulate how something appears to be relatively two-dimensional and straightforward initially, but actually the more you consider it and the more you understand its implications, it has a much more profound abstract suggestion. So you could say about the stranger God dream, the hallucination at the beginning of Death in Venice. At first glance, Aschenbach's hallucination seems to reveal his desire for exoticism and otherness that he fulfills through travel. It's about rainforests and foreign lands. However, on closer inspection, the imagery also alludes to the latent eroticism involved in his Dionysian longings, the kind of hidden sexuality of his Dionysian desire, if you look at it more closely. So it's that useful sentence structure that's separated by the semicolon for balancing out those two independent clauses and saying, well, when you look at it first, it looks like this, but actually, if you think about it a little bit more and take more time, we can see this slightly more subtle detail. This is a good way of introducing a kind of extended passage of analysis and pinpointing what it is that you will be focusing on, and really your focus would be on that, whatever it is on closer inspection you would be able to find. Close language analysis is what you've seen if you've looked at those model paragraphs here. Zooming in on a word or phrases in their connotations or the effect of a technique. So it could be employs the word or it uses the word something suggests. It could be a phrase to imply or reinforce or emphasize, or it could be a particular literary technique. So here's an example of describing the maniac's face after he finds out that the police have revealed their own corruption. It says here, Foe's description of the smile as beatific, that sense of deep peace, underlines the sense of inner peace that this revelation has created for the maniac as his moral purpose is fulfilled after he's managed to get the police to expose themselves. The second one here is really just about pinpointing that you've got a second idea. I just call it stretch and shift. Use a transition, explore a second implication. Further to this, moreover, in addition, lots of you do this already and lots of you use these relatively well, but you have to think a bit more precisely about actually what each of these transition phrases mean. In addition means I'm saying another thing that is directly related to the previous one. Moreover really means I'm continuing with this idea. So you could say this, further to this, the writer may also be implying that this vision of the sea as purple is a product of the violence that Mira has previously experienced. This is an example from Crossing the Mangrove, dealing with her vision of the sea as purple. So you pinpoint that you've got a second idea with a transition, explore a second implication. The last two, noticing subtleties. This is if you think there's something particularly ingenious or clever or subtle about what a writer is doing. And it connects to Crossing the Mangrove here. Here the writer ingeniously employs the imagery of water to reveal the underlying emotional conditions that have facilitated the character's overall development, which in turn has enabled the possibility of fulfillment. So we're talking there about the water imagery in Crossing the Mangrove. This one here is really the most useful to you because this, by default, can't be repetitive, and it's the bulk of what you tend to do in analysis. Chopchipping quotes. And here what we mean by this is basically paraphrase the example, include the most emotive or trigger words and phrases from the quote itself within your paraphrasing of the example. So here, the same passage from Accidental Death of an Anarchist. Here, the way that the maniac smiles, revealing his satisfaction with the fact that the police are now leading the interrogation themselves, whilst its beatific quality gives us a sense of the inner peace he has now discovered in the knowledge that his moral purpose has been fulfilled. So here, all you're doing is paraphrasing in your own words what's going on, but then weaving the most emotive words, the most important words from the quotes in terms of their implied meaning into your paraphrase, and then articulating what they suggest. So it's really paraphrase, individual words, Chopchip we call it, so that they're just small little bites of quotation rather than big chunks, and then the implications of those trigger words within that paraphrase. This is your most useful strategy because you can keep doing it over and over again as long as you vary the way that it begins, the way that, the fact that, the way in which, all these phrases are useful to begin those sentences. This is the most versatile technique for probing quotations and pulling out their implications. The last one is if you're really trying to develop your analysis with more than one example. So what you do is you define the concept in the previous one and link it to the next example. So this sense of, and that's where you want a nominalized abstract noun. This sense of intangibility, injustice, the exposure of corruption, redemption, degradation, all of those abstract nouns, those thematic conceptual words. Define what's in the previous quote, say how it's developed later. This sense of intangibility that this image creates is also evident in the later image of the majestic bird taking flight. So there we've got an example from one of the Dickinson poems that we looked at previously. So I hope these help you. These are, you want to be careful with these that you don't formulaically repeat them over and over again. But when you've got these as sort of automated methods of analyzing language, you'll find that you aren't stuck for what to do. Actually, this is feedback that is particularly useful to you on paper 2, where you might use just one of these to probe one of your supporting details a little bit more deeply and to connect it back to the question. But in terms of the WA, this is the real meat of the analysis, is carrying out sentence structures like this that allow you to pull out implication from the quotes and explain how the style is constructing meaning.